Dear listeners, welcome to another story from ancient world history. This time it's from ancient Arab. Welcome to Listen Whispers of the Desert, the Rise of Al-Qamar. In this tale, you'll journey with Prince Faris as he faces betrayal, battles, and the weight of destiny in his quest to restore a lost kingdom. Through ancient prophecies and fierce trials, Faris must navigate the treacherous sands of both the desert and his own heart. Join us as we uncover the secrets of Al-Rashi, where power, vengeance, and fate collide. Enjoy the adventure. Let's start. The sun hung high over the dry, endless expanse of the Arabian desert. Its rays beat down mercilessly on the land, causing the sand to shimmer as though alive. From the horizon, no civilization was visible, only the vastness of the wilderness, stretching as far as the eye could see. Yet amid this barren land, a single ancient city thrived, a city surrounded by lush oases and flourishing life. This was Al-Qamar, a beacon of civilization in the midst of the unforgiving desert. Al-Qamar was no ordinary city. It was a place of legends. The name itself meant moon in Arabic, chosen because the moon had long guided the Bedouins across the desert at night. The city was founded centuries ago by the Al-Sadi family, who were revered not only for their wisdom and leadership, but also for their connection to the land, the moon, and the stars above. The Al-Sadi dynasty had ruled Al-Qamar for generations, their wealth and power unmatched in the region. The people believed that their ancestors had been chosen by the gods themselves, their rule blessed by the moon. At the center of this flourishing city stood the majestic palace of the Al-Sadi family. Built from pale stone and adorned with intricate carvings, the palace was a testament to the prosperity that the family had brought to the city. It was here that Prince Faris al-Sadi, heir to the throne, spent most of his days training with his sword and learning the ways of leadership from his father, King Khalid. However, despite his privileges, Faris often felt a deep sense of emptiness. His life was predetermined. He was to become king, lead the city, and uphold the traditions of his ancestors. But he longed for something more, something beyond the confines of royal duties and expectations. On one such night, as Faris sat alone on the palace balcony, gazing at the stars, a figure emerged from the shadows. An old man, bent with age, his face weathered by time and desert winds. The man's robe was tattered, and his eyes glimmered with a strange ancient knowledge. His name was Yazin, a wanderer who had traveled the desert for many years. Faris had heard of him. He was a storyteller, a keeper of forgotten tales, and a mystic who had long been rumored to possess knowledge of the ancient world. Prince Faris, Yazin greeted him, his voice raspy but firm. I have come to tell you of a secret that has long been buried beneath the sands. Faris turned to face the old man, his curiosity piqued. A secret? What kind of secret? Yazin smiled, his eyes glinting with a knowing look. A secret that has the power to change the course of your life, young prince. It is a story of an artifact, a weapon of immense power, lost to time. They say it was crafted by the gods themselves, a spear forged from the heavens, imbued with the power of the desert and the moon. Faris stepped forward, his interest deepening. A weapon of the gods? Tell me more. Yazin's gaze grew distant, as though recalling a memory long forgotten. The artifact is called the Spear of Rash. It is said to be hidden deep within the desert, beneath the sands of the old kingdoms. The spear has the power to grant its wielder unimaginable strength, the ability to command the very forces of nature itself. It was once wielded by a great king, a ruler who could shape the desert with a single command. Faris could hardly believe what he was hearing. The stories of the ancient kings were nothing more than myths passed down through generations, whispered around campfires by the elders. Yet here was this man, telling him that the legend was real. Why are you telling? Me this? Faris asked, his voice tinged with both excitement and doubt. Why me? Yazan's eyes fixed on him, piercing through him as if seeing into the depths of his soul. Because, Prince Faris, you are the one destined to find the spear. It is your fate to reclaim what was lost, to restore the power of your ancestors. The gods have chosen you, but you must seek it yourself. No one can find it for you. The words hung in the air like a weight, pressing down on Faris's heart. He had always felt that there was more to his destiny than simply inheriting the throne. But could this be real? Was there truly a weapon capable of changing the balance of power in the desert? Yazan stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The spear is not only a weapon of power, but it is also a key to the forgotten city of Al-Rashi, the lost kingdom that once ruled the desert. If you find the spear, you will also uncover the truth about your lineage, your families, connection to the ancient rulers of the desert. But beware, Prince Faris. Others are searching for it, and they will stop at nothing to claim it for themselves. Faris's mind raced. A lost city, a weapon of the gods, and a connection to his family's past. This was more than he could have ever imagined. He had always felt a deep connection to the desert, as though the land itself called to him. And now, it seemed, the desert was offering him a chance to discover its most guarded secret. I will go, Faris said, his voice steady and determined. I will find the spear. Yazan nodded, as though he had been expecting this answer. Then prepare yourself, Prince. The journey will not be easy, and the path ahead will test you in ways you cannot yet comprehend. You will face danger, betrayal, and darkness. But if you are truly meant to succeed, the desert will guide you. With those final words, Yazan turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Faris standing alone, his heart pounding with anticipation. The moon above was full, casting a pale light over the city, and in that moment, Faris knew his life would never be the same. The next morning, Faris gathered his most trusted companions: Abdullah, his loyal bodyguard; Layla, a skilled healer with a mysterious past; and Zayd, a warrior whose loyalty was only to the desert. Together, they would embark on a journey that would take them deep into the heart of the desert, where the lines between myth and reality blurred, and where the secrets of the past awaited to be uncovered. As they rode out from the gates of Al-Qamar, Faris looked back at the city won last time. The palace, the people, the life he had always known, it all seemed so distant now. Ahead of him lay the unknown, a vast, uncharted wilderness. But he was not afraid. The desert called to him, and he would answer. The journey had begun. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a vast ocean of golden sand under the unforgiving sun. It was a world that was both beautiful and terrifying, a place where life could be sustained or destroyed with the slightest change in the winds. Prince Faris al-Sadi, along with his companions, rode tirelessly across this barren land, guided by nothing but the memories of old stories and the promise of a forgotten destiny. The journey had begun under the brightest of moons, the one Yazan had spoken of, but now, as the days passed, the moon seemed more like an ethereal ghost, its light faint, barely illuminating the path ahead. Faris couldn't help but feel a sense of growing unease. He was far from the safety of Al-Qamar, his home, and the desert was slowly revealing its true nature. As they traversed the dunes, Faris's mind was heavy with the words of the old man. The spear of Raj, a weapon of the gods, a key to the lost kingdom of Al-Rashi, a tool that could shape the fate of nations, seemed more like a distant dream than a reality. But the more he thought about it, the more he felt that his entire life had led him to this point. Was he truly destined to find this spear? Was his family, the great Al-Sadi dynasty, connected to this forgotten kingdom, as Yazan had suggested? The desert seemed to murmur secrets to him on the wind, whispers carried by the dry air. It was as though the sands themselves were alive, aware of his presence, watching him. Faris couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested, that the desert was not just a physical obstacle, but a force to reckon with. Every night, as they made camp under the starry sky, Faris found himself looking up at the moon, trying to decipher its meaning. The first days of the journey passed uneventfully. They traveled from one oasis to the next, following ancient trade routes long forgotten by most. Along the way, they encountered nomadic tribes who spoke of their own, ancient stories and legends. One such tribe, the Banu Hawar, spoke of a time when the moon had once been a source of power, a guiding force for all those who traveled the desert. But the tribe's elders also warned Faris of a curse that hung over the land, a curse tied to the ancient kingdoms that had once ruled the desert. They spoke in hushed tones about Al-Rashi, the lost kingdom, and how the gods had abandoned it. "Beware, young prince," one of the elders had warned Faris, his voice low and grave. "The moon may guide you, but it also watches you. The path you are on is fraught with peril, and you must tread carefully." Faris had listened intently, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. There was something in him, a spark of determination, that refused to yield. This was his fate, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. It was on the fourth day of their journey that they stumbled upon the first sign of the Spear of Rosh. They had reached the edge of an ancient valley, a place known to few, but spoken of in the old songs of the Bedouins. The valley was a vast expanse of cracked earth, lined with jagged rocks and scattered with the remnants of long-dead plants. The air was still, and the silence was unnerving. It felt as though they had entered a place untouched by time, a place that had been forgotten by the world. Faris's eyes scanned the valley, his senses on high alert. The wind had died down, and the sky above had darkened, casting an eerie glow over the land. It was then that he saw it, half buried in the sand, an ornate carving on the side of a rock. The design was unfamiliar, but something about it resonated deeply within him. He dismounted from his camel and approached the rock, his fingers brushing against the intricate patterns carved into its surface. The symbols seemed to pulse with energy, as if they were alive. He felt a strange warmth emanating from them, a warmth that seemed to draw him closer. Layla, the healer, who had been following behind, approached him cautiously. "What is it, Prince?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity and concern. "What do you see?" Faris didn't answer immediately. He traced the symbols with his fingers, feeling a deep connection to them. Then, as if guided by an unseen force, he pressed a particular part of the carving, and the ground beneath them trembled. The sand around the rock shifted, and slowly, as if awakened from a long slumber, a hidden entrance revealed itself. The path leading underground was narrow and steep, and Faris could feel a cold draft coming from below. The air smelled of age, and dust, and the stone steps that descended were slick with moisture. "Stay here," Faris ordered his companions. "I will go alone." But Zayd, his loyal warrior, stepped forward. "I will accompany you, my prince," he said firmly. No man should enter such a place alone. Faris hesitated for a moment, then nodded. There was something about the place that seemed dangerous. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but the lure of the unknown was too great. With Zayd by his side, Faris took his first step into the darkness of the valley. As they descended into the depths, the air grew cooler, and the walls around them seemed to close in. Faris's heart raced with excitement and fear. What lay at the end of this path? Was this the place where the Spear of Rosh was hidden? Or was it something more sinister? The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning through. The earth, the further they went, the darker it became. Soon, even the faint light from above had vanished, and the only illumination came from the small lantern Zayd carried. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. Then, as they rounded a corner, they came to an open chamber. It was vast, far larger than any room they had encountered. The walls were adorned with ancient murals depicting scenes of kings and warriors, battles fought in the name of the gods and gods themselves, figures both human and divine, cloaked in mystery. At the far end of the chamber stood an altar, atop which rested a single object covered in a cloth. Faris's pulse quickened as he approached, his heart thundering in his chest. Could this be it, the spear of Rosh? He reached out, his hands trembling, and removed the cloth. But what he saw left him breathless. It was not a spear that lay before him, but a set of ancient scrolls. Their edges were frayed, and the ink had long since faded, but the symbols upon them were unmistakable. Faris recognized some of them. They were the same symbols he had seen on the rock above. "This isn't the weapon we were seeking," Zayd whispered, his voice tinged with disappointment. But Faris was not so sure. These scrolls held the key to something far greater. This was a message from the past, and it was up to him to decipher. As he unrolled the first scroll, a sense of dread washed over him. The words were clear, but the prophecy they contained was one he could not yet understand. He looked up at Zayd, who was watching him with concern. "We need to go deeper," Faris said, determination in his eyes. "This is only the beginning." But, as he spoke, the ground beneath them trembled once more, and a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The desert had awakened, and it was no longer going to let them leave easily. The tremor that shook the chamber seemed like the earth itself was waking from a long slumber. The ground cracked beneath Faris's feet as dust and debris fell from the stone ceiling. His heart raced in his chest, his grip tightening around. The scrolls. The quiet, eerie stillness of the underground chamber was now replaced with an ominous rumble that seemed to reverberate deep into the bones of the earth itself. "Faris!" Zayd's voice cut through the tension, filled with both fear and urgency. "We must leave now." Faris stood frozen, his eyes locked on the scrolls. The feeling of destiny had enveloped him since the moment he had set foot on this path. And now, as the room shook, he felt an even stronger pull, a force that seemed to call him to the heart of the desert, to the very origins of the lost kingdom of Al-Rashi. But despite his instinct to stay and explore further, Faris knew Zayd was right. The danger in the chamber was palpable, and the rumblings only grew louder with each passing second. The ancient walls were unstable, and the threat of the entire structure collapsing was real. Zayd grabbed Faris by the arm and pulled him toward the exit. "We can come back later," he urged, his voice harsh with panic. "The desert will not forgive those who disturb its peace." Reluctantly, Faris allowed Zayd to guide him back through the winding tunnels. As they ascended the stone staircase and emerged back into the open valley, they could hear the rumble of distant thunder echoing through the vast emptiness of the desert. But there were no clouds, no sign of a storm on the horizon. It was as though the desert itself was growling in warning. The air outside was heavy with heat, but Faris barely noticed as he gazed back at the valley, the echoes of the rumble still reverberating in his mind. The moment they had uncovered the scrolls, the world had shifted. The connection between the ancient kingdom of Al-Rashi and his own family had become undeniable. What were those scrolls? Zayd asked, his voice trembling with both awe and fear as they mounted their camels. "I don't know yet," Faris replied, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "But I believe they are part of something much larger, something that ties my family's lineage to the lost kingdom." The spear was never the true answer. The scrolls, they hold the real secret. They continued their journey, leaving the valley behind, but the feeling of unease stayed with Faris. The scrolls weighed heavily in his satchel, their ancient ink beckoning him to understand. But with each mile they traveled deeper into the desert, a sense of foreboding clung to them. The desert was not merely a place of sand and sun. It was a kingdom of shadows, a place where the forgotten gods once ruled and where time had forgotten to pass. As the sun began to set behind the dunes, casting long shadows over the sand, the landscape seemed to change before their eyes. The world felt different here, unnatural. The air shimmered with an eerie quality, and Faris could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, as they set up camp under a canopy of stars, Faris could not sleep. He lay awake, his mind racing with thoughts of the scrolls of Al-Rashi and of the ancient kings that once ruled the desert. The more he thought about the scrolls, the more he realized they held not just the secrets of the past, but clues to the future. A future that was slowly unfolding before his eyes. As the campfire flickered, Faris could hear the soft whispers of the desert wind. There were stories, legends, in the wind, tales of lost civilizations, of kings who wielded the power of the gods, and of great battles fought beneath the scorching sun. The wind carried the whispers of those who had come before, and the desert, it seemed, was telling him to listen. In the distance, the faint outline of a mountain range began to emerge as the stars shifted overhead. The journey was far from over. The lost kingdom of Al-Rashi lay beyond these mountains, deep in the heart of the desert. And Faris knew that whatever awaited him, there would change everything. But even as he sat by the fire, his thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of hooves. At first, it was barely noticeable, but soon it grew louder, growing nearer with each passing second. Faris stood up quickly, his senses on high alert. Zaid, who had been keeping watch, turned to him. "Do you hear that?" Faris nodded. "Someone is coming." The sound of hooves grew louder, until a group of riders appeared on the horizon, silhouetted by the setting sun. There were 5 of them riding swiftly across the dunes, their faces obscured by dark veils and hoods. They rode with purpose, their eyes fixed ahead as if they knew exactly where they were going. As they drew closer, Faris could make out the markings on their robes, the symbol of the Banu Hawar, the nomadic tribe that had warned him earlier of the curse of the lost kingdom. Faris had heard of them before, desert wanderers, experts in navigating the harshest terrains, and keepers of ancient knowledge. But something about this group felt different. They were not here to offer guidance. They were here with a purpose. The riders stopped just a few paces from Faris and his companions. The leader of the group, a tall man with a deep, commanding voice, spoke first. "We have been following you, Prince Faris," he said, his tone unwavering. "The desert speaks. Can we listen? It has called us to you." Faris stood his ground, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Why have you come?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. "We come because we know of your quest," the leader replied. "You seek the lost kingdom, but you are not the only one searching for it. Others are hunting for it too, those who would use the power of the kingdom for their own ends. And they are closer than you think." Faris's heart skipped a beat. "Who are they?" he demanded. The man's eyes narrowed. "We cannot tell you who they are, but we can offer you a warning. The path you walk will lead you to a confrontation, one that will determine the fate of the desert itself. If you continue, you must be prepared. You will face enemies both seen and unseen, and the desert will be your greatest ally or your greatest foe." With that cryptic warning, the Banu Hawar leader turned his horse around and signaled for his riders to leave. They disappeared into the desert as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Faris and his companions in stunned silence. Faris felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known the desert was full of dangers, but now, more than ever, he realized the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The spear of Rosh, the lost kingdom, his family's legacy. It was all connected to something far greater, something that could reshape the balance of power in the desert. But there was one thing that Faris now knew for certain. The road ahead would not be easy, and the enemies he would face would be just as ruthless as the desert itself. As the night deepened and the stars shimmered above, Faris sat by the fire, the scrolls resting beside him. He had come this far, but the true journey was just beginning. And in the distance, beyond the mountains, the shadows of a forgotten kingdom waited to be uncovered. The desert is a place of extremes, a realm where nothing is permanent, and the landscape shifts as swiftly as the wind. What seems like an oasis one day could become a mirage the next. Faris and his companions had journeyed for many days now, following the path outlined by the scrolls and guided by the whispers of the Banu Hawar tribe. The heat was unbearable, the sun an unrelenting force, and yet their quest carried them forward with unwavering determination. Their destination was near, the cursed oasis. But Faris had heard no stories about this place. None of the legends mentioned this particular oasis. And yet, there it was, standing like a beacon on the horizon. An oasis in the midst of a barren desert should have been a blessing, a place of rest and rejuvenation. But this one felt different. The air around it seemed charged, heavy with an unseen presence. As they drew closer, the clear waters sparkled in the midday sun, surrounded by lush greenery and palm trees that seemed out of place in the arid surroundings. But Faris knew better than to trust appearances in the desert. The feeling in the air was wrong. There was something unnatural about this oasis. The warnings from the Banu Hawar tribe echoed in his mind. The desert will be your greatest ally or your greatest foe. Faris had always believed in the desert's power, but now he was beginning to understand just how much danger they had put themselves in. Zaid, ever vigilant, was the first to speak. "Prince, I don't like this. We should keep moving. Something about this place feels wrong." Faris, however, was determined. The scrolls had led them here, and he believed that they held the answers to the mysteries surrounding al-Rashi and his family's legacy. "We've come this far, Zaid. We cannot turn back now." The group approached the edge of the oasis cautiously. The water, though clear, seemed unnaturally still, and the wind had died down entirely. It was as if the world around them was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They dismounted their camels and approached the water's edge, where the lush vegetation grew thick and wild. Faris's eyes swept over the area, searching for any signs of danger, but it was the trees that caught his attention. There, among the palms, he saw a figure. It was a woman, tall and pale, her long hair flowing like silver, and her eyes as dark as the night sky. She was standing still, her gaze fixed on them, unblinking. Her presence sent a shiver down Faris's spine. He had never seen her before, and yet there was something about her that felt familiar. She spoke, her voice like a whisper carried by the wind. "You've come to seek the kingdom's power, Prince. But are you prepared for what you will find?" Faris's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword, but he did not draw it. There was something about her, something ethereal, that made him hesitate. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I am the guardian of the oasis," the woman replied. "I am the keeper of the curse that binds this land. You seek the lost kingdom of al-Rashi, but you do not understand what you are truly searching for." Zaid stepped forward, his expression filled with suspicion. "A curse? This oasis is cursed?" The woman nodded solemnly. "Yes. This oasis was once the heart of al-Rashi, a kingdom blessed by the gods. But it was also the site of a great betrayal, a betrayal that caused the gods to abandon the kingdom and curse this land forever. The waters here may look pure, but they hold the bitterness of the past. The lush greenery is a facade, a false mask hiding the true nature of this place." Faris's curiosity grew. He had heard of the ancient kingdom of Al-Rashi, the legendary rulers who had once controlled the desert. But the tales had always been vague, clouded by time and mystery. Now, here was someone, a guardian of the oasis, who claimed to know. "The truth. Tell me more," Faris urged. "What happened to Al-Rashi? Why is it cursed?" The woman's eyes grew darker, and she began to walk slowly toward the water, her feet barely touching the ground. Long ago, Al-Rashi was a kingdom of unimaginable power, where kings ruled with wisdom and strength. But power, like all things, comes with a price. The king of Al-Rashi, a man named Jamal al-Karim, sought to control the forces of the desert itself. He desired to wield the power of the gods, to become more than just a king. He wanted to become a god. Faris listened intently. The name Jamal al-Karim was unfamiliar, but it was clear from the woman's tone that he was someone of great significance. The king's greed led him to seek out the Spear of Rosh, the woman continued, her voice tinged with sorrow. He believed that by wielding it, he could control the very elements, the winds, the sand, the stars. But the spear did not grant him the power he desired. Instead, it consumed him. It drove him mad, and in his madness, he betrayed those closest to him. Faris's heart raced. The Spear of Rashi, the very object he had set out to find, had been the catalyst for the downfall of Al-Rashi. But how was that possible? The spear was supposed to be a weapon of unimaginable power, not a force of destruction. What happened to the kingdom? Faris asked, his voice barely a whisper. The gods saw the king's betrayal, and their anger was swift, the woman said, her gaze distant, as though she were reliving the events. They cursed the land, turning it into a wasteland. The oasis became the heart of that curse, a place where the souls of the betrayed and the corrupted were trapped for eternity. The kingdom fell, its people scattered to the winds, and the gods abandoned the land. The curse remains to this day, and anyone who seeks the spear is bound to face the wrath of the gods. Faris's mind reeled. The history of Al-Rashi was more than he had ever imagined. The spear, the kingdom, the betrayal, it all tied back. To his family's bloodline, to his destiny. But what did this curse mean for him? Was he doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past? He stepped forward, determined. What must I do to lift the curse? To find the kingdom? The woman's gaze turned cold. There is no way to lift the curse. It is bound to the land, to the very fabric of time itself. But the spear can still be wielded. But beware, Prince Faris. If you seek to wield it, you must be prepared to pay the price. The gods do not forgive easily. Faris clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. He would find the spear, no matter the cost. The fate of the kingdom and of his own bloodline depended on it. Then I will pay whatever price is necessary, Faris declared. The woman nodded slowly. Very well. But know this, nothing in the desert is as it seems. The closer you get to the spear, the more you will be tested. The desert will consume those who are unworthy. And the curse will follow you until the very end. With that, she turned and disappeared into the oasis, leaving Faris and his companions alone once more. The air around them grew colder, the atmosphere heavier. Faris knew that the oasis was more than just a place. It was a warning. The curse of Al-Rashi was alive, and it would stop at nothing to prevent him from finding the spear. But he had already made his choice. He would face whatever darkness awaited him, for the kingdom, for his family, and for the future of the desert. The moon hung low in the sky that night, casting a pale, ghostly light over the desert. Its soft glow reflected off the sands, giving the illusion of a world bathed in silver. But for Faris al-Saadi, heir to the throne of Al-Qamar, the deserts, beauty held no comfort tonight. The journey had taken them deep into the heart of the desert, to a place where the whispers of the past collided with the dangers of the present. The oasis had only been the beginning. Despite the warnings of the Guardian and the palpable curse that clung to the land, Faris pressed forward with unyielding determination. But as the journey continued, he began to notice something he couldn't ignore, something that had begun to stir within the ranks of his own group. Zaid, his loyal companion, had been distant ever since they left the cursed oasis. The once unwavering bond between them seemed to have faltered, and Faris couldn't help but sense that something was off. There was a tension in the air, a quiet unease that grew with each passing day. Zaid had become more withdrawn, his eyes always scanning the horizon as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. Layla, the healer too, seemed less at ease. She had always been quiet and reserved, but now there was an anxiety in her manner, a nervousness that Faris had never seen before. And even though he trusted her skills and knowledge, something about her silent concern made him uneasy. It was on the 8th day after their departure from the oasis that the first true sign of betrayal revealed itself. The day had been grueling, with the relentless sun beating down on them and the wind growing fierce. They had stopped to rest at a small outcrop of rocks, an oasis of sorts in the vast sea of sand. Faris sat on a large stone, sipping from his water skin, while Zaid and Layla prepared the camp for the night. Faris, however, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was subtle at first, the flicker of movement out of the corner of his eye, the faint echo of footsteps in the distance. But as the shadows lengthened, the feeling grew stronger, more urgent. He stood up, his instincts on high alert. "What's wrong, Prince?" Layla asked, noticing his sudden shift in demeanor. "I don't know," Faris replied, his gaze scanning the horizon, "but I have the distinct feeling we are not alone." Before Layla could respond, Zaid came over, his face grim. "We're being followed," he said quietly. "I've seen the same figures at the edge of the dunes. They're not here by chance." Faris's heart skipped a beat. Zaid had always been observant, and if he noticed something, it was worth paying attention to. "Who are they?" Faris asked, his voice tense. "Are they from Al-Qamar or the Banu Hawar?" Zaid shook his head. "They're not from Al-Qamar or Banu Hawar. They're something else, mercenaries, perhaps, or something worse." Faris's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. "How many?" "I counted 3, Zaid replied. "But there could be more." Layla looked between them, her expression hardening. "Then we must prepare ourselves. We can't afford to be caught off guard." They worked quickly, setting up the campfire to mask their movements and fortifying their defenses. The stars above shimmered like ancient eyes, watching them from the heavens. The silence of the desert was deafening, as if holding its breath. In anticipation, as night fell, the shadows grew deeper. Faris couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that hung over them. He paced around the camp, his hand always near his sword, his eyes darting toward the distant dunes where the figures had been. But despite their preparations, the attackers did not reveal themselves. Hours passed, and the tension mounted. Then, just as Faris was about to order a retreat, he heard a rustling sound behind him. "Prince!" Zaid shouted, his voice sharp with alarm. Faris spun around just in time to see Zaid fall to the ground with a dagger buried deep in his side. A figure cloaked in shadow stood over him, the blade still dripping with blood. "No!" Faris shouted, rushing forward to help Zaid, but before he could reach him, another figure lunged from the darkness, knocking him to the ground. Faris's world exploded in chaos. The figures were everywhere, swarming around him like vultures. They wore black, their faces hidden behind masks, but their movements were swift and practiced. Faris struggled to regain his footing, drawing his sword in a single motion. The cool steel glinted in the moonlight as he slashed at the nearest attacker. The fight was brutal. The mercenaries were skilled, and though Faris fought with all his might, the sheer number of them was overwhelming. Layla, too, was caught in the melee, using her knowledge of herbs to throw sand and blinding powders into the attackers' faces. But it was clear that they were outnumbered. "Faris!" Layla cried, her voice strained as she tried to ward off another attacker. "We need to retreat. We can't win this fight." But Faris, driven by a sense of duty, couldn't bring himself to leave his companion behind. Zayd was already gravely wounded, and he needed to stay and protect them both. In the midst of the chaos, Faris saw something that made his blood run. Cold Zayd, lying motionless on the ground, his face twisted in pain. A figure had knelt beside him, and Faris could see the flash of a dagger as it went in and out of Zayd's side. It wasn't just an attack, it was an execution. Faris roared, in anger, charging at the assailant with newfound fury. But as he reached them, the figure looked up, and Faris's heart skipped a beat. The face was familiar, a face he had trusted, one that had stood beside him for years. It was Layla. "No," Faris whispered, his breath catching in his throat. "Layla." She didn't speak, but her eyes, those eyes, were filled with a coldness he had never seen before. The love and compassion he had once seen in her were gone, replaced by something darker. Faris's mind raced. How could this be? Layla, the woman who had healed his wounds, guided him with wisdom, and stood by his side. How could she betray him? As if in response to his unspoken thoughts, Layla smiled darkly. "Did you really think I was on your side, Prince Faris?" Her voice was a low, almost mocking whisper. "Did you truly believe you were destined to find the spear? That you, of all people, could wield it without consequence?" Faris stood frozen, disbelief washing over him. "You?" He could barely form the words. "You've been with me this whole time." "I've been with you," Layla said, her eyes hardening. "But I am not who you think I am. I am no healer, no servant of the gods. I am a servant of Al-Rashi, and I was sent to stop you." The words struck Faris like a blow. The woman he had trusted, the one he had relied on, had been deceiving him all along. Her loyalty was never to him or to the desert, but to something far older, far darker. The silence was broken by a voice from behind Faris. "You should have known, Prince," said Zayd, his voice weak but defiant. He struggled to sit up, his blood staining the sand around him. "She's been working with them." Before Faris could respond, Zayd fell back into unconsciousness, his body succumbing to the blood loss. The mercenaries closed in, their weapons drawn. Faris, his heart broken by the betrayal, stood his ground. "I won't let you win," he spat. Layla's lips curled into a smile. "You never had a choice, Faris. The gods decided long ago that your bloodline would fall." And with that, the figures in the desert encircled him, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight, ready to finish what had been set into motion long before Faris had ever discovered the truth about Al-Rashi. The desert was quiet, save for the occasional wind that stirred the sand and the faint sound of footsteps dragging across the earth. Faris stood alone, his sword bloodied and his heart heavy with the weight of betrayal. The once peaceful oasis, which had seemed like a place of salvation, had turned into a battlefield, one where the bonds of trust had been shattered beyond repair. Zayd lay motionless on the ground, his body a tragic reminder of the fight they had lost. Layla's betrayal cut deeper than any blade. She had been his ally, his confidant, and his friend. Yet, in the cruelest of twists, it was she who had turned against him, leading the mercenaries who sought to stop him from uncovering the truths of the ancient kingdom. Her face haunted him, her words echoing in his mind. The gods decided long ago that your bloodline would fall. As Faris knelt beside Zayd, a chilling realization gripped him. Their quest for the Spear of Rosh had not been a mere search for an artifact, but a confrontation with forces far beyond his understanding. The spear, the kingdom, the desert. It was all tied to an ancient power that had been waiting for centuries to be awakened. The very fabric of the desert seemed to shift with each passing moment, and Faris knew he was no longer just a prince on a journey. He was a part of something much larger, something he could no longer control. The shadows of the night stretched long across the desert floor as the figures of the mercenaries began to close in on him. Faris's pulse quickened. There was no escape. He had no allies, no sanctuary. Even the desert itself, which had once felt like a friend, now seemed to mock him, casting him deeper into despair. Yet, in the depths of his heart, a spark of defiance remained. His destiny had never been one of comfort or peace. The gods had chosen him for this path, and whether he was ready or not, it was his responsibility to see it through. If the gods had abandoned him, then it was time to stand on his own. If the desert sought to break him, then he would rise stronger than ever before. Faris slowly rose to his feet, wiping the blood from his sword. His eyes narrowed as he surveyed the mercenaries. They were circling him, their weapons raised, their faces masked. But even in the face of imminent death, Faris felt a strange calm wash over him. This was the trial he had been destined for, a trial that would determine not only his survival, but the fate of the lost kingdom of Al-Rashi. Before he could make his move, the leader of the mercenaries stepped forward. A tall man, his face obscured by a black veil, his voice low and commanding. "You are a stubborn one, Prince Faris," the leader said, his words carrying an air of mockery. "But you must know by now that resistance is futile. The gods have already spoken. Your fate was sealed the moment you set foot on this path." Faris gripped his sword tightly, his knuckles white. "You think you can defeat me?" he spat. "I am not afraid of you, nor your gods." The leader smiled beneath his veil. "We are not here to defeat you, Prince. We are here to guide you to your destiny. And your destiny is death." With that, the mercenaries closed in, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. Faris took a deep breath, centering himself. His eyes darted from one mercenary to another, his mind calculating their every move. There was no way out of this. But there was something else, something buried deep within him that had been awakened in the desert, a strength he had never known. In a flash, Faris moved. The first mercenary lunged at him, sword raised high, but Faris was faster. He sidestepped the attack, his sword flashing as he struck the mercenary's side. The man crumpled to the ground with a cry, his life snuffed out in an instant. The others hesitated for a split second, stunned by Faris's swift movements. But they quickly recovered, rushing at him in unison. Faris fought with all his might, his body moving with a grace he had never before experienced. His sword was a blur as he parried and struck, his heart beating in rhythm with the desert winds. But for every mercenary he took down, two more appeared in his place. It became clear to Faris that these were not ordinary foes. They were trained assassins, their movements as coordinated as a deadly dance. The weight of their numbers began to take its toll, and soon Faris found himself overwhelmed. A blow to his side sent him sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he pushed it aside, refusing to show weakness. The mercenaries closed in on him, their eyes glinting with victory. But as they prepared to strike the final blow, a sudden sound echoed through the desert, a loud, commanding voice that made the mercenaries freeze in their tracks. Enough. The voice was cold, powerful, and filled with authority. The mercenaries turned as one, their eyes widening in recognition. A figure appeared from the shadows, stepping into the moonlight. It was Layla. But she was not the woman Faris had known. Her eyes, once warm and kind, were now cold and emotionless. She was no longer the healer, the ally. She was something else entirely. The dark cloak she wore billowed in the wind, and in her hand was the same dagger she had used to. Betray Zayd. It gleamed in the moonlight, a symbol of her treachery. Layla, Faris called out, his voice hoarse with disbelief. What is this? What have you become? She looked at him with an unreadable expression, her face emotionless. I have become what I was always meant to be. The gods chose me, Faris. You were never meant to find the spear of Rosh. It is a weapon too powerful for mortals like you. You cannot control it. You cannot control the desert. Faris's heart sank. The truth hit him like a blow. Layla had never been on his side. She had never been his ally. She had always been a part of the forces that sought to stop him, to prevent him from uncovering the secrets of Al-Rashi. She had played him like a pawn, guiding him down a path of destruction. I won't let you win, Faris said, his voice filled with determination. I won't let you control me. Layla's lips curled into a smirk. You have no choice. You were born into this. Your bloodline is tied to the gods, and they will decide your fate. The mercenaries stepped back, sensing the tension in the air. Faris could see in their eyes that they were waiting for Layla's command to strike. But he knew that this was not just a fight for his life. It was a fight for the future of the desert, for the kingdom of Al-Rashi, and for the power of the spear of Rosh. He had to win. He had no choice. Faris's sword gleamed in the moonlight as he stood tall, his legs shaking with exhaustion, but his resolve stronger than ever. He was not just fighting for his survival. He was fighting for the future of the desert, for the legacy of his ancestors, and for his own destiny. Layla raised her hand, signaling the mercenaries to stand back. She took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. This is your final chance, Faris, she said coldly. Surrender. Let the gods take control of your fate, and I will spare your life. But Faris only stared at her, his eyes burning with defiance. I will never surrender to you, he said, his voice steady. I will fight, no matter the cost. Layla's expression darkened, and with a flick of her wrist, she gave the signal. The mercenaries lunged at Faris in unison, their weapons flashing like deadly serpents in the moonlight. The battle had begun, and Faris knew that the outcome would decide not only his fate, but the future of the entire desert. The moon hung like a silent witness above the desert, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The clash of steel echoed through the night, the sounds of blades meeting flesh and bone reverberating in Faris's ears. His heart pounded in his chest as he fought with all his might, his sword flashing in the moonlight, his body moving with a ferocity he had never known. The mercenaries were relentless, their attacks coordinated and swift. They moved like shadows, closing in from all sides, their eyes burning with a cold, unwavering determination. But Faris was not just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for something far greater. The spear of Rosh was within his reach. The lost kingdom of Al-Rashi, his family's bloodline, the desert itself, all of it was tied to this moment. He couldn't afford to fail. But with each passing strike, the weight of betrayal pressed down on him. Layla's cold words echoed in his mind. The gods chose me. You were never meant to find the spear. The woman he had trusted, the one who had stood by him through the trials of the desert, had been playing him all along. She had deceived him from the start, a part of a larger plot to control the power of the desert, to keep the spear of Rosh from falling into the wrong hands, his. The realization hit him like a wave. She was no mere healer. She was a servant of something darker, something ancient. And now, standing before him, she was ready to finish what she had started. But Faris would not let her win. With every slash of his sword, he fought not just against the mercenaries, but against the ghosts of the past that haunted him. The voices of his ancestors seemed to whisper through the wind, urging him forward. He was their blood, their legacy. He was the Prince of Al-Qamar, and he would not let it fall into darkness. His gaze shifted toward the distant dunes where the ancient city of Al-Rashi was said to lie. The images from the scrolls, the symbols, the prophecies, flooded his mind. He could almost see the grandeur of the kingdom in his mind's eye. The temples, the palaces, the rulers who had once wielded the spear of Rosh as if it were an extension of their will. He could feel their presence, their power, coursing through his veins, urging him to stand tall, to never back down. But Layla's figure loomed like a shadow in his thoughts, reminding him of the price he had to pay to uncover the secrets of the past. Faris barely had time to react as a mercenary lunged at him with a dagger. The man's speed was unmatched, but Faris parried the strike just in time, his sword clanging against the blade with a sharp metallic sound. He countered with a swift move, his sword slicing through the mercenary's chest, sending the man crumpling to the ground. But even as one foe fell, more emerged from the darkness. Faris's body was aching, his muscles screaming for rest, but he pressed on. There was no time for weakness. He had a kingdom to save. And then, amidst the chaos, a voice rang out, a voice he knew too well. Enough, Faris froze. It was Layla. She stood at the edge of the battlefield, her dark cloak billowing. In the wind, her eyes filled with an icy resolve. In her hands, she held the dagger that had once belonged to Zayd, the very dagger she had used to betray him. She raised it, her gaze never leaving Faris's, and with a swift motion, she signaled the mercenaries to halt. They froze like puppets. With their strings cut, Faris's breath caught in his throat. The silence that followed was deafening. He could hear the wind, the distant rustle of the sands, but nothing else. The mercenaries remained still, awaiting her command. "What is this, Layla?" Faris demanded, his voice hoarse from the battle. "Why do you betray me? What is it that you seek?" Layla's lips curled into a smile, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down Faris's spine. "You still don't understand, do you, Prince Faris?" she said, her voice low and almost pitying. "You were never meant to find the spear of Rosh. You were never meant to wield it. The gods decided long ago that your bloodline would be the end of this kingdom, and I was sent to ensure that it remains buried." Faris's mind raced. The gods decided long ago? The words burned into his thoughts. This was bigger than just Layla. This was about the fate of Al-Rashi, the spear of Rosh, and the power that had been locked away for centuries. This was about a kingdom that had been lost to time, and Faris was the one chosen to reclaim it, whether the gods approved or not. Layla continued, her eyes cold and distant. "You've always believed that your family's bloodline was chosen by the gods, but the truth is far darker than you can imagine. Your family's legacy is tied to the fall of Al-Rashi, not its rise. The gods chose me to prevent you from ever finding the spear of Rosh, and now your journey ends here." Faris stood frozen, the weight of her words sinking in. The gods chose her? His mind screamed for understanding, but there was no time for answers. The battle was far from over. "You won't win, Layla," Faris said, his voice filled with determination. "The desert may have its trials, but I will see this through. I will find the truth, no matter the cost." The mercenaries began to advance once more, but Layla raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "No, Prince," she said coldly, her voice like ice. "You will not. You have no idea what you are up against. The curse of Al-Rashi is not just a story. It is a truth that has been hidden for centuries. And you, Faris, are the key to it all?" Faris's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What is the curse?" Layla's smile faded, and for the first time, Faris saw a flicker of something ancient and dark in her eyes. The curse of Al-Rashi is not just about the spear. It's about power that the gods cannot control. The spear of Rash was not a weapon of light or hope. It was a tool of destruction, forged in the fires of the gods' own fears. And you, Prince Faris, are the last heir of that power. If you claim it, you will unleash forces that even the gods cannot. Stop. Faris's blood ran cold. The weight of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The spear of Rash was not just a weapon. It was a force that could break the world itself. The gods had chosen him to find it, but they had never intended for him to wield it. Faris was not a savior. He was a catalyst. The gods had left him a broken legacy, one that would be his to redeem or destroy. Faris turned to the mercenaries, his voice filled with cold resolve. I will not let this kingdom fall any further. I will find the spear, and I will decide. Its fate, not you, not the gods. Layla's eyes narrowed, and she stepped forward, her dagger gleaming in the moonlight. Then you will die trying. And with that, the final confrontation began. The battle that followed was unlike any Faris had ever faced. His body was battered and broken, his strength fading, but the will to survive driven by his bloodline. And the legacy he carried kept him standing. He fought with everything he had, not just for his life, but for the future of the desert, for the future of his people, and for the kingdom that had been lost to time. As the fight raged on, Faris felt the presence of something greater, something ancient, pulsing in the air around him. The desert itself seemed to be watching, waiting. The echoes of the past were closing in, and Faris knew that the trial he faced was not just a battle for survival, but for the soul of Al-Rashi itself. The battle raged on like a storm in the desert, fierce and unrelenting, with no end in sight. Faris stood at the center of it, bloodied and battered, his body aching with every movement, but his resolve unbroken. His sword, the sword of his ancestors, gleamed in the moonlight as he fought with every ounce of strength left within him. Each strike felt like it was tearing through the very fabric of time, the legacy of his bloodline coming to life with every blow. But Layla's mercenaries were relentless, their training impeccable. Even in the chaos of the desert night, they moved like shadows, closing in on him from all sides. They were skilled, and they were numerous. But Faris was not alone. As the fight wore on, he began to sense something shifting within himself, something deeper, more primal. It was as if the desert itself was awakening, calling to him, pushing him forward. The spear of Rash, the object of his quest, the key to the lost kingdom, was not just an artifact. It was a symbol of power, of blood, and of destiny. And it was now within his reach. The ancient texts, the scrolls that had guided him this far, spoke of a sword, a legendary weapon known as the Sword of the Falcon. It was said to be wielded by the first king of Al-Rashi, a ruler whose strength and vision had shaped the desert. The sword was not just a weapon. It was a beacon of hope, the key to restoring the kingdom to its former glory. Faris had thought little of it, focusing all his attention on the spear of Rash. But now, as he fought for his life in the shadow of betrayal, he realized the sword was his true inheritance. The sword was the final piece of the puzzle, and it was time to claim it. The mercenaries pressed in, their movements swift and deadly. Faris fought back with a precision that surprised even himself, his strikes fueled by a power he could not explain. His sword felt lighter in his hand, almost alive, as though it was responding to his every command. Each swing brought him closer to his goal. But despite his newfound strength, he knew that time was running out. Layla was not far behind, and the moment she struck, he would lose everything. He could feel her presence, the cold, unfeeling gaze of his once trusted ally. She stood on the edge of the battle, her eyes fixed on him, watching with a sense of detached satisfaction. But Faris could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had betrayed him, but deep down, she was afraid, and that fear was his advantage. "Layla," Faris called out, his voice rising above the clashing of swords. "This is not the way. You were meant to help me, to guide me. This path you've chosen, it will lead to nothing but destruction." Layla's gaze remained cold, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You still don't understand, do you, Prince? The Spear of Rosh is not a gift, it is a curse. It was never meant to be wielded by anyone, not even you." Faris's heart burned with anger, but he knew this was the moment of truth. This was his trial, the one the desert had whispered about, the one his ancestors had foretold. The sword of the falcon would guide him. He needed to find it, and he needed to find it now. With a fierce cry, Faris charged forward, cutting through the mercenaries with a speed and precision that left them no time to react. He moved like a storm, his sword an extension of his body, every strike fueled by the ancient power of his bloodline. The mercenaries fell back, but Faris was not interested in them. He had one goal, one path forward, and that path led him to the sword. The ancient texts had spoken of a hidden temple deep within the desert, buried beneath the sands of time. And as the battle around him continued, Faris felt the pull of that place, as if the very earth was guiding him. The sword of the falcon was close. He could feel it. And with each step, the air seemed to grow heavier, as though the desert itself was holding its breath. He fought through the remaining mercenaries, his sword cutting through them with a ferocity that left no room for hesitation. He had no time to mourn the loss of Zayd, his friend who had died at the hands of the very people they had once trusted. His betrayal was a wound in Faris's heart, but there was no time to heal it. The kingdom was at stake, and Faris was the last hope. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Faris emerged from the chaos of the battle and found himself at the base of a rocky outcrop. The desert stretched before him, the sands swirling in the wind. And there, standing like a sentinel in the distance, was the entrance to the hidden temple. The ancient stone door, covered in intricate carvings, beckoned him forward. Faris's breath caught in his throat. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. The sword of the falcon was inside, and with it, the power to reclaim the lost kingdom of Al-Rashi. He approached the door, his heart racing. The markings on the stone were familiar, symbols from the scrolls, patterns he had seen before. They seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as if the temple was alive, waiting for him. With a deep breath, Faris placed his hand on the door, and the moment his fingers made contact, the stone rumbled, and the massive door slowly began to open. A surge of energy washed over him, and Faris stepped inside. The air was cool and thick with the weight of history. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, their images telling stories of kings, battles, and the rise and fall of Al-Rashi. The temple seemed to hum with power, as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Faris to claim his birthright. In the center of the chamber stood an altar, and upon it lay the sword of the falcon. It was unlike any weapon Faris had ever seen. Its blade gleamed with a strange, otherworldly light, and the hilt was adorned with intricate designs, runes and symbols that Faris could not understand, but that seemed to call to him. The sword was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of the kings who had once ruled the desert, the rulers whose blood ran through Faris's veins. He approached the altar slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The sword was his, but it was more than just a weapon. It was the key to the kingdom. The legacy of Al-Rashi was bound to it, and Faris knew that the moment he claimed it, there would be no turning back. His fate would be sealed. With trembling hands, Faris grasped the hilt of the sword. The moment his fingers touched the blade, a surge of power coursed through him, and he could feel the presence of the kings who had come before him. The desert seemed to speak in whispers, calling to him, urging him to rise to his destiny. The sword of the falcon was now his, but the journey was far from over. Faris could feel the weight of the ancient curse that had followed him since the beginning of his quest. The gods had abandoned Al-Rashi, but their power still lingered in the sands, and Faris knew that he would have to face the consequences of his actions. As he stood there, holding the sword in his hands, he felt the presence of Layla behind him. She had followed him into the temple, her eyes filled with cold determination. "You think the sword will save you, Faris?" Layla's voice rang out, sharp and full of disdain. "You are still just a pawn in a game far beyond your understanding." Faris turned to face her, his sword raised. "I am no pawn," he said, his voice steady and filled with the power of his ancestors. "I am the Prince of Al-Qamar, and I will reclaim what is mine." The final confrontation had arrived, and this time, it was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the very soul of the desert. The air in the temple was thick with anticipation. The sword of the falcon pulsed in Faris's hand, its power overwhelming, yet it felt strangely familiar, as if it had always been a part of him. The blade shimmered with an ethereal glow, casting long shadows across the ancient stone walls. Faris stood tall, his eyes locked on Layla, the woman who had once been his ally but had now revealed herself as his enemy. Behind him, the shadows of the desert seemed to whisper, urging him forward, but his focus remained on the woman who had betrayed him. "You think the sword makes you powerful, Prince Faris?" Layla sneered, her eyes filled with disdain. "You are nothing but a puppet, a fool who believes he can change the course of history. The gods have already decided your fate. You will never reclaim Al-Rashi. Not with the sword, not with the spear." Faris gripped the hilt of the sword, tighter, his knuckles white. Her words stung, but they no longer held the power they once did. Layla had once been a friend, a trusted companion. But now, she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world that had been shaped by betrayal, by greed, and by the gods who had abandoned them all. It was time to end this, once and for all. "I am no puppet, Layla," Faris sighed, his voice steady and unwavering. "I am the Prince of Al-Qamar, and the desert itself has chosen me. You were never meant to stop me. You were just another obstacle in the path that I must walk." The silence that followed was deafening. The weight of the sword in Faris's hand seemed to anchor him to the earth, grounding him in the moment. He had come too far to turn back. The spear of Rash, the ancient kingdom, the legacy of his bloodline, it all led to this moment. Layla stepped closer, her eyes dark with hatred. "You don't understand, do you, Faris? The spear of Rash was never meant to be wielded by man. The gods created it to keep the power of Al-Rashi locked away, to prevent anyone from abusing its might. But you, with your arrogance, think you can control it. You think you can control the desert. But the desert will destroy you." Faris shook his head, his grip tightening around the sword. "The gods abandoned Al-Rashi long ago. They left us to fight for ourselves. If they won't help us, then we must help ourselves. The spear of Rash was never meant to destroy. It was meant to protect, and I will use it to restore the kingdom, to bring peace to the desert." Layla's laugh echoed through the temple, cold and bitter. "Peace? There is no peace in the desert, Faris. There is only survival. And you," she pointed a finger at him, "are too weak to survive the truth. You are just like your ancestors, blinded by power, blinded by greed. You will fall, just as they did." Faris stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. "If I fall, I will fall fighting for what is right. I will not let this kingdom die. not without a fight. Layla's eyes flashed with fury. She lunged at him, her dagger gleaming in the dim light of the temple. Faris was ready. With a swift motion, he parried her attack, their blades clashing. With a sharp, metallic sound, the force of her strike sent a shockwave through his body, but he stood firm, his feet planted firmly on the ground. This was his moment, his trial. "You are nothing," Layla hissed. "Just a boy playing at being a king. You think you can change the course of history? You are no king. You are a puppet, and the gods will make sure you know it." Faris's heart pounded in his chest, but he was no longer afraid. Layla's words, once filled with venom and authority, now felt like the ramblings of a broken soul. She was the one who had been blinded by the gods' promises, the one who had let the darkness consume her. She was the one who had betrayed her people, her kingdom, and her prince. "You are wrong, Layla," Faris said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I will not be a pawn in the gods' game. I will fight for my kingdom, for my people, and I will not let anyone stand in my way." With that, he raised the sword of the falcon, its blade shimmering with an otherworldly light. Layla stepped back, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had underestimated him, underestimated the power that flowed through his veins. The sword of the falcon was not just a weapon. It was the key to his destiny. It was the key to restoring Al-Rashi, to reclaiming the power of the desert. Layla raised her dagger once more, but Faris was faster. With a single fluid motion, he struck. The sword cut through the air like a force of nature, its edge sharp and precise. Layla's dagger fell from her hand, the clang of metal ringing. Through the temple, Faris stood over her, the sword poised for the final strike. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body weary from the fight. But he knew this was the end. The gods had abandoned him long ago, and now it was up to him to forge his own destiny, to restore the kingdom, to claim the power of Al-Rashi. Layla's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You think you can stop the desert?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The desert will consume you, Faris. You are nothing but a shadow of the past." Faris's heart wavered for a brief moment. But then, the images of Al-Rashi, the lost city, the kings, the ancestors, who had shaped this land, flashed in his mind. He was not just fighting for himself. He was fighting for them, for the future, for the desert. With a swift motion, Faris brought the sword down. The blade pierced the air, and in that moment, Layla's fate was sealed. Her body crumpled to the ground, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling of the temple. Faris stood over her, his chest heaving, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The spear of Rash, the object that had led him here, was still waiting for him. He could feel its power, calling to him from the depths of the temple. But before he could turn to claim it, a strange noise echoed through the chamber, a low rumble like the sound of the earth shifting beneath him. Faris's eyes widened as the ground trembled and a voice echoed from the depths of the temple. It was not Layla's voice. It was something darker, something ancient. "You have claimed the sword, Prince Faris, but it is not the sword that will decide your fate." The words sent a chill down his spine. The voice seemed to come from all around him, as if the very walls of the temple were alive. "Your journey is far from over," the voice continued. "The spear of Rash is only the beginning, and with it you will face the greatest trial of all." Faris turned, his eyes searching the darkness of the temple. He could feel it now, the weight of the gods' gaze upon him, the ancient forces that had shaped this land and its history. He had come to claim the power of Al-Rashi, but now he realized the true trial was just beginning. The spear of Rash was not just a weapon, it was a test of his worth, his will, and his ability to control the very power of the desert. And as Faris stepped forward, he knew one thing for certain. The desert would not give up its secrets easily. To claim a power of the lost kingdom, he would have to face the gods themselves. The desert air was thick with an unsettling stillness, the silence broken only by the faint rustling of Faris's cloak as he stepped deeper into the ancient temple. The walls seemed to pulse with the echoes of forgotten time, each step he took reverberating through the centuries. The sword of the falcon hummed in his grip, its blade glowing faintly in the dim light. Faris's heart raced as the same ancient voice that had spoken to him earlier, whispered through the shadows. "Of the temple, you have claimed the sword, Prince Faris," the voice said, its tone laced with an eerie calmness. "But you are not yet ready for what lies ahead." Faris's pulse quickened. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it seemed to surround him. There was no one in sight, but he knew deep in his bones that the temple itself was alive. It was watching him, judging him, waiting for him to prove himself worthy of its ancient power. He had come so far, through the treacherous desert, through the betrayal of those he had trusted, and now, with the sword in his hand, he was standing on the precipice of his destiny. But the weight of that destiny was heavier than he had ever imagined. The spear of Rosh lay ahead of him, its power tantalizingly close. He could feel it, the pull of it, like a magnetic force drawing him toward it. But something about the voice that now seemed to echo within the very walls of the temple, made him hesitate. He stopped, glancing around the chamber. The air was thick with the scent of ancient dust, the stone walls covered in inscriptions, the remnants of a forgotten civilization. But amidst the carvings, one symbol stood out. It was a serpent, etched deeply into the stone, winding its way up the wall in a spiral pattern. Its eyes were wide and unblinking, its mouth open in a silent hiss. The serpent seemed to watch him as he approached. Faris felt a chill run down his spine. He had seen this symbol before, in the scrolls he had uncovered, in the stories that had been passed down through generations. The serpent was a symbol of the gods, of Rashi, the god who had once ruled over the lost kingdom, whose followers had built this very temple. The serpent was a reminder of the power of the desert, a reminder that the gods had created the land in their image. It was a symbol of both life and death, of creation and destruction. And now it was here, staring back at him as if warning him. Without a word, Faris stepped forward, his sword at the ready. The air around him seemed to shift, the temperature dropping, as though the very earth was holding its breath. He had come this far. He could not turn back now. The voice returned, louder this time, its presence more oppressive. The spear of Rosh is not just a weapon, Prince Faris. It is the key to understanding the true nature of this land. It is the key to unlocking the power of the gods themselves. But beware, the gods do not give power freely. To wield the spear, you must first face the serpent's trial. You must prove yourself worthy. Faris's grip on the sword tightened. The serpent's trial? What did that mean? The trials of the desert had already tested him to his limits, hadn't they? His journey had been nothing but trials, each one more dangerous than the last. But this felt different. The serpent's trial was not just a battle. It was something more, something ancient and deep, hidden beneath the sands of time. The walls of the temple trembled, and the ground beneath. Faris's feet seemed to shift. He felt a presence, a force, stirring in the darkness. And then, from the very stone itself, the serpent's form began to emerge. At first, it was subtle, a ripple in the air, a distortion in the shadows. But then, with an almost deafening hiss, the serpent slithered from the wall, its massive form coiling around the chamber. Its eyes glowed with a fierce, unearthly light, and its scales shimmered like molten metal. It was no mere symbol. This was a living, breathing manifestation of the god's power. The serpent was alive. Faris stepped back, his sword raised, his breath shallow. The creature was enormous, its body stretching across the temple like a living mountain. It circled him, its eyes locked onto his, its gaze intense and calculating. "You seek the spear of Rash, Prince Faris," the voice said again, its tone now filled with a sense of inevitability. "But the spear is not given. It must be earned. You must face the serpent, the guardian of the lost kingdom, and prove your worth. Only then will you be allowed to claim the power of Al-Rashi." Faris's heart pounded in his chest. The serpent was more than just a trial. It was a test of his spirit, his soul. It was the desert's way of judging him, of measuring his worth. The gods had abandoned Al-Rashi, but the power of the serpent remained. And now it was up to Faris to face it. With a roar, the serpent lunged at him, its massive body twisting through the air like a whirlwind. Faris leapt to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. The serpent's jaws snapped shut with a deafening crack, and Faris's heart raced as he spun around, his sword raised. The serpent was faster than he had anticipated, its movements fluid and graceful despite its size. He struck with all his might, his sword cutting through the air, but the serpent was too quick. It coiled around him, its scales flashing in the dim light of the temple. Faris's sword was caught in the serpent's body, and for a moment, he was held fast, the weight of the creature pressing down on him. He struggled against the serpent's grip, his muscles straining. The creature's eyes were filled with an ancient wisdom, and as Faris looked into them, he felt something stir deep within him, something primal, something that connected him to the desert, to the gods, to the very heart of Al-Rashi. It was as if the serpent was speaking to him, telling him that this was his destiny, that he was the one chosen to restore the kingdom, to wield the spear of Rash. But first, he had to survive this trial. With a grunt, Faris pulled his sword free, slashing at the serpent's body. It recoiled, its enormous form writhing in pain. Faris took his chance, leaping forward with renewed determination. He struck again, this time cutting deep into the serpent's scales. The creature howled in fury, but Faris pressed on, his sword striking with deadly precision. The serpent was weakening. Faris could feel it. The power of the serpent, the power of the gods, was flowing through him. He had been chosen. The desert had chosen him. With one final, forceful strike, Faris drove his sword deep into the serpent's heart. The creature let out a deafening hiss, its body writhing and twisting in its death throes. Faris held his ground, his sword lodged in the serpent's body, his heart pounding in his chest. The serpent's eyes flashed one last time before it collapsed to the ground, its massive form shaking the temple. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the serpent was gone. The darkness that had once filled the chamber lifted, leaving Faris standing alone in the silence. The air was still. The only sound was the echo of his own breath, the thudding of his heart in his chest. And then, from the shadows, the voice spoke again. "You have passed the trial, Prince Faris. You have proven your worth. The spear of Rash is yours to claim." Faris stood, his sword still in his hand, his body weary, but his spirit stronger than ever. He had faced the serpent, the guardian of the lost kingdom, and he had won. The power of Al-Rashi was now within his reach. But with that power came a responsibility, a burden that Faris had not yet fully understood. The spear of Rash was no ordinary weapon. It was a force that could shape the destiny of the desert, for better or for worse. And Faris knew that it was now up to him to decide how that power would be used. He stepped forward, his footsteps echoing in the temple, and there, at the far end of the chamber, he saw it, the spear of Rash resting upon an altar. Its shaft gleamed with an ancient power, its tip sharp and unyielding. The power of the gods, the power of Al-Rashi, was contained within that spear. Faris reached for it, his fingers brushing the hilt, and as he did, the world seemed to shift. The air around him crackled with energy, and he felt the weight of history, the weight of the gods, bearing down on him. This was his moment, his trial, and his destiny. With the spear of Rash in his hand, Faris knew that the true battle was only just beginning. The desert had chosen him, and now it was time for him to rise. The spear of Rash pulsed with energy, its ancient power thrumming through Faris's fingers as he gripped the shaft. The moment he had been waiting for, the moment he had sought through blood, betrayal, and countless trials, was now at hand. He had faced the serpent, the living embodiment of the desert's will, and emerged victorious. The serpent's trial had tested not just his strength, but his spirit, his heart, and his resolve. But the spear of Rash was more than just a weapon. It was the key to unlocking the full potential of his bloodline, a power that was tied to the very foundation of Al-Rashi, the lost kingdom that had once ruled the desert. Faris could feel it now, the weight of that power, the weight of his ancestors' legacy pressing down on him. The gods had abandoned Al-Rashi, and it was now up to him to restore what had been lost. He stood in the heart of the temple, the spear of Rash gleaming in the dim light, casting long shadows across the stone walls. The air was thick with the ancient energy that radiated from the spear, and Faris could feel the desert itself, responding to its presence. It was as if the land was alive, waiting for its rightful ruler to reclaim the throne, to restore the kingdom. But as Faris stood there, his mind began to swirl with thoughts of vengeance. Vengeance for the betrayal he had suffered at the hands of Layla. Vengeance for Zayd, who had given his life to protect him. Vengeance for the destruction of his kingdom, for the blood of his people that had been spilled in the name of power. And greed. The desert had been a place of suffering, of hardship, and of loss. But now, with the spear of Rash in his hand, Faris knew that it was time to set things right. The voice of the temple echoed in his mind, reminding him of the gods' ancient words. Only through fire will the desert be cleansed. Only through fire will the kingdom rise again. He had been chosen by the desert, chosen to wield the power of the gods, chosen to restore the kingdom of Al-Rashi. But in order to do so, he would need to embrace the fire that burned within him, the fire that would cleanse the land and bring justice to those who had wronged him. Faris turned toward the altar where the spear of Rash had rested. His eyes narrowed in determination. The fire within him burned brighter now, fed by the memories of his ancestors, by the pain of betrayal, and by the weight of his destiny. The desert would rise again, and he would be its king. The voice of the temple spoke again, softer this time, almost as a whisper. The flames of vengeance can burn bright, Faris, but beware. The fire that you seek may consume you if you are not careful. You must strike with purpose, with clarity. The spear is a tool of justice, not of rage. Faris took a deep breath, grounding himself. He had come this far, and he could not falter now. His destiny was clear, and it was in his hands. The spear of Rash would restore the lost kingdom, but only if he wielded it with wisdom and strength. Vengeance was necessary, yes, but vengeance without purpose would destroy everything he had fought for. He turned and walked toward the entrance of the temple, the spear of Rash now firmly in his grasp. His steps echoed through the chamber, each one resonating with the power of the desert. He had faced the serpent, he had claimed the sword, and now he would face the true test, the test of his heart, of his mind, and of his ability to control the power that was now his. As he stepped out into the desert, the vast expanse of sand stretching before him, he saw the familiar dunes rising and falling in the distance. The moon hung high in the sky, its light illuminating the land with a soft, ethereal glow. The air was still, the winds silent, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his next move. He could see the outline of Al-Qamar in the distance, the city that had been his home, the city that had been built on the foundation of his ancestors. But the city was no longer a place of safety or peace. It was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The Al-Sadi dynasty had ruled with power, but they had also ruled with arrogance. They had betrayed the desert, and now the desert was calling for justice. Faris raised the spear of Rash, the blade catching the light of the moon. The spear seemed to hum with power, the energy of the desert surging through it. This was the weapon of the gods, a weapon that could change the fate of the world. But Faris knew that he could not wield it blindly. He could not allow the fire of vengeance to consume him. As he walked toward Al-Qamar, his thoughts turned to Layla, to Zayd, to the betrayal that had shaped this path. They had all played their parts in the story of Al-Rashi, but the story was far from over. Faris had a choice to continue down the path of vengeance, to destroy everything in his path, or to use the power of the spear to rebuild what had been lost. He could feel the weight of that decision bearing down on him. The fire of vengeance burned in his heart, but the power of the spear was a force that could reshape the world. The gods had abandoned him, yes, but the desert had chosen him. And it was up to him to decide what kind of king he would become. The moon hung high above the desert, casting its light on the world below. And Faris, Prince of Al-Qamar, walked alone through the sands, his destiny unfolding before him. The flames of vengeance burned within him, but he knew that the fire would either burn him to ash or forge him into the ruler he was destined to be. The journey had not ended. It had only just begun. The desert was quiet again, its vastness stretching endlessly before Faris. The wind had picked up, a dry, whispering breeze that seemed to carry the scent of sand and ancient earth. As he walked toward Al-Qamar, his heart beat in rhythm with the rhythm of the desert itself. He had the spear of Rash now, the key to restoring the kingdom, and yet the weight of it felt heavier than he had ever imagined. Every step he took seemed to echo with the history of his ancestors. The Al-Sadi dynasty had ruled Al-Qamar for generations, but their reign had been tainted by pride, greed, and a disconnect from the very land they ruled. Faris had long been taught that his bloodline was blessed, that the gods had chosen him to rule, but he had learned that the gods, much like the desert itself, were not to be trusted blindly. They had abandoned him, and now it was up to him to restore the balance. The moon was high above the desert, casting its pale light on the sands. Faris's eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the city of Al-Qamar stood. The city had once been a beacon of prosperity and power, but now it felt like a shadow of what it had once been. His people had forgotten their connection to the desert, forgotten the price of their arrogance. But Faris would change that. He would reclaim the kingdom, not as a puppet of the gods, but as a king who understood the land, its power, and its price. The spear of Rash hummed in his hand, the ancient energy of the desert swirling around it. It was as if the very earth beneath his feet was alive, responding to the power of the spear. The weapon was more than just a tool of destruction. It was a force of creation, a force that could either restore Al-Rashi to its former glory or burn it to the ground. And it was Faris's choice. He had been chosen, not by the gods, but by the desert itself. The power of the spear was his to wield, but only if he was worthy. As he reached the gates of Al-Qamar, he could see the faint glow of torches in the distance. The city was awake, but it was not the bustling metropolis he had once known. It was a city on edge, a city that had long been fractured by corruption and betrayal. The people of Al-Qamar had long since lost their way, and Faris knew that his return would not be welcomed by all. But that did not matter. He had come back for one purpose: to restore his kingdom, to reclaim the throne, and to rebuild the bond between his people and the desert. The gods had left him to fight his own battles, but he would not fail. Not now, not after everything he had endured. As he approached the city's entrance, he was stopped by the guards. They wore the insignia of the Al-Sadi dynasty, but their faces were cold and emotionless. They did not recognize him at first, the prince who had once been the heir to the throne. Faris stood tall, the spear of Rash in his hand, its energy radiating from him like an aura. "I am Prince Faris," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "I have come to reclaim my kingdom." The guards hesitated, their eyes flickering between each other. It was clear they did not recognize him, but there was something in his eyes, a fire, a determination that made them step aside. They had heard the whispers of the prince who had survived the desert, who had passed the trials, who had come to claim his birthright. And now, here he stood before them, a man transformed, a king reborn. As Faris walked into the city, the streets felt strangely empty. The people went about their business, but their eyes were downcast, their faces weary. They had long since lost hope, long since abandoned the idea of a true ruler. Al-Qamar had fallen into disrepair, its once great walls crumbling, its grand buildings falling into ruin. The city, once a symbol of power, now felt like a ghost town, haunted by its own past. But Faris knew that this was not the end. This was just the beginning. He made his way toward the palace, the heart of Al-Qamar, where the throne had once belonged to his father, King Khalid. The palace loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the night sky. Faris's footsteps echoed in the empty streets as he approached the gates. The guards at the palace gates looked at him with suspicion, but as they saw the spear of Rash in his hand, their eyes widened in recognition. The weapon of the gods, the weapon that had been lost for centuries. It was the symbol of the true king, the rightful ruler of Al-Qamar. The guards opened the gates without a word, allowing Faris to enter the palace grounds. The courtyard was eerily silent, the fountains dry, the gardens overgrown with weeds. The palace had once been a place of grandeur, of celebration, but now it felt like a tomb. The walls were cracked, the marble floors chipped, and the once gilded statues of the gods were now tarnished, their faces worn by time. Faris walked through the empty halls, his mind racing. He could feel the weight of history pressing down on him, the burden of his ancestors' choices. They had ruled with pride, with arrogance, and in doing so, they had sealed their own fate. But Faris would not make the same mistakes. He would rebuild the kingdom, but this time it would be built on the foundations of respect for the desert, for the land that had given them everything. He reached the throne room, the massive doors standing before him like a barrier. The throne was empty, the seat of power vacant. Faris stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the silence, the emptiness, the weight of what he was about to do. This was it. This was his moment. He had come to claim his birthright, to restore Al-Qamar to its former glory. But the kingdom was not just a city, it was a symbol of power, of life, and of death. The throne was not a seat of privilege, it was a seat of responsibility. With a deep breath, Faris pushed open the doors and stepped into the throne room. The room was vast, its high ceilings lost in shadow. The grand tapestries that once adorned the walls had faded, their colors muted by time. The golden statues of the gods, which had once stood as symbols of divine power, were now tarnished, their features barely recognizable. Faris walked toward the throne, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to do. The spear of Rash pulsed in his hand, its energy vibrating through his body. This was his moment. This was his kingdom, and he would not let it fall again. He stood before the throne, his eyes fixed on the seat that had once belonged to his father. He could feel the presence of his ancestors in the room, their spirits watching, waiting. The desert had chosen him. The gods had abandoned him. But the power of the spear of Rosh was his to command. Faris knelt before the throne, the spear resting against the ground. He closed his eyes and allowed the power of the desert to fill him. He could feel the ancient energy surging through his veins, the weight of history and destiny pressing down on him. But this time, it was different. He was no longer the prince who had been guided by others. He was the king, the ruler of the desert, and he would restore the kingdom to its rightful place. The throne room seemed to shift, the air thick with the energy of the desert. The walls, once crumbling, began to glow with a faint light. The tapestries seemed to come to life, their colors brightening, their images shifting as if the past was coming back to life. Faris could hear the whispers of his ancestors in the air, urging him forward, telling him to rise. He stood, his heart filled with a sense of purpose he had never known before. He was no longer just a prince. He was the king of Al-Qamar, the ruler of the desert, and with the spear of Rashi in his hand, he would rebuild the kingdom. The air hummed with power, and as Faris raised the spear, the room seemed to come alive, the walls vibrating with ancient energy. The desert had chosen him, and now he was ready to claim his place as the rightful ruler of the lost kingdom. The desert was alive with unrest. Faris stood atop the palace balcony, the cool night breeze lifting the edges of his cloak as he gazed out across the sprawling city of Al-Qamar. The city had once been a place of prosperity, but now it was a fractured shell of what it had been, filled with distrust and division. The power of the spear of Rosh had awakened something ancient in the land, something that could either heal the wounds of the past or plunge the desert into an even deeper abyss. The air smelled of dust and smoke as far as the eye could see. Faris could feel the unrest in the city's streets, the murmurs of the people who had once looked to his father as a symbol of strength. Now they looked to him, not with hope, but with fear. The throne that his father had once occupied seemed to weigh heavily on him, a reminder that the kingdom had fallen into ruin, and the people were unsure of the future. But Faris had no intention of succumbing to fear. He had come to reclaim the sea, throne to restore the kingdom, and to rebuild the relationship between his people and the desert. But the spear of Rosh was a double-edged sword, and the power it held would either make him the ruler his ancestors had dreamed of, or destroy everything in its wake. The gods had abandoned him. The Al-Sadi dynasty had ruled with arrogance, forgetting their bond with the desert, and now Faris was left to pick up the pieces. His ancestors had been blessed with power, but that blessing had turned into a curse. And now, it was his turn to wield that power. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the ruined city, Faris knew that the moment of reckoning had arrived. The battle to reclaim Al-Rashi had begun, and it would not be fought with weapons alone. It would be fought with blood, with sacrifice, and with the full force of the desert's will. Faris walked into the war room, his footsteps echoing in the cold stone corridors of the palace. The room was dimly lit, the heavy curtains blocking out the morning sun, but the faces of the council members were clear, their expressions grim. At the head of the table stood Zayd's younger brother, Akram, who had taken his place as the leader of the kingdom's military forces in Zayd's absence. Akram was a tall man, his features sharp and angular, his eyes fierce with determination. He was not a man of words, but of action, and Faris knew that his loyalty to the Al-Sadi family was unquestionable. But loyalty alone was not enough to win the war that was now brewing in the desert. There were others, those who had long been enemies of the kingdom, who had learned to exploit its weaknesses and now sought to capitalize on its collapse. Faris. Akram greeted him with a nod, though his eyes seemed troubled. We've received word from the Banu Hawar. They've gathered their forces, and their allies among the mercenaries are moving toward Al-Qamar. They intend to destroy everything we've worked to rebuild. Faris's gaze hardened as he took a seat at the table. The Banu Hawar had been one of the desert's most powerful tribes, known for their nomadic ways and their fierce loyalty to the ancient gods. The tribe had long been suspicious of the Al-Sadi dynasty, and Faris knew that they had been watching him ever since he had begun his quest to reclaim the Spear of Rosh. Now, it seemed, they had decided to make their move. We cannot let them tear down everything we've worked for, Faris said, his voice cold and resolute. This kingdom belongs to the people of the desert, and I will not allow it to fall into chaos. Akram nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. We have no choice but to fight. We have our allies, but they are few, and the Banu Hawar has more forces than we could ever hope to assemble in time. Faris leaned forward, his fingers wrapped around the hilt of the Spear of Rosh resting beside him. The weapon was an extension of his will, a symbol of his authority, but it was also a reminder that the fate of Al-Qamar rested in his hands. The war was no longer about reclaiming a throne. It was about survival. The desert itself was watching, waiting for the outcome. We will not just defend, Faris said, his voice firm. We will take the fight to them. We will unite the desert. Tribes call on those who still honor the old ways. The power of the spear is not just a weapon. It is the key to restoring the kingdom. We will show them that Al-Qamar is not a kingdom to be conquered. Akram looked at him, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. And the Banu Hawar? How do you intend to unite the tribes when they have turned against us? Faris stood, his hand resting on the spear. We will remind them of who we are. We will call upon the memory of Al-Rashi, of the kingdom that once ruled this land. The Spear of Rosh was forged to protect this kingdom, and if the tribes remember their heritage, they will answer the call. The days that followed were filled with tension. Faris met with his generals, laying out the plan for the upcoming battle. The city of Al-Qamar would be the final battleground, but the war would be fought in the desert, where the power of the tribes and the mercenaries would clash. Faris knew that the battle would not be won by strength alone. It would be won by the heart and soul of the desert. Faris sent messengers to the remaining tribes, those who still held to the old ways, asking them to join his cause. He needed their warriors, their knowledge of the desert, and their loyalty to the land. Some answered the call, while others hesitated. The Banu Hawar's influence had spread far, and not all were willing to risk their lives for a kingdom that had long since ended its people. But Faris was resolute. He would not let his people fall into darkness. He would fight for them, for Zayd, for his ancestors, and for the kingdom that had once stood as a beacon of power and prosperity. The night before the battle, Faris stood, alone on the balcony of the palace, gazing out over the desert. The stars above seemed to swirl in patterns, as if the heavens themselves were aligning in preparation for the coming war. The land was still silent, as though it too was holding its breath. The Spear of Rashu was in his hand, its power thrumming beneath his fingertips. He could feel the weight of his ancestors upon him, the ghosts of Al-Rashi urging him to rise to reclaim what had been lost. His heart burned with a need for vengeance, not just for himself, but for the desert, for the people of Al-Qamar, for the kingdom that had once ruled this land. The battle would not be easy. The forces of the Banu Hawar were powerful and their mercenaries ruthless. But Faris had something they did not: the strength of his bloodline, the power of the Spear of Rosh, and the unwavering will to restore what had been broken. As he looked toward the horizon, he knew that the battle to come would shape the future of the desert. It would be a war of sand and blood, a war that would determine whether the kingdom of Al-Rashi would rise again, or if it would be lost forever. The war for the desert had begun. The night before the battle, the desert seemed to whisper in a language that only the ancient sands could understand. Faris stood alone on the high balcony of the palace, staring out across the dunes that stretched like an endless ocean. The sky above was an ink-black canvas, the stars shining with a cold, distant brilliance. It was as though the very heavens were watching over him, awaiting the dawn and the greatest trial of his life. The spear of Rasha was in his grasp, its power undeniable, yet its weight felt like a burden. Faris knew that the day to come would not only determine his fate, but also the fate of Al-Qamar and the lost kingdom of Al-Rashi. The prophecy, the ancient words whispered through the generations, had come full circle. The desert had chosen him, but what price would it demand for its blessing? In the quiet of the night, as the wind howled through the cracked walls of the palace, Faris felt the weight of history pressing down on him. He could almost hear the whispers of his ancestors, the rulers of Al-Rashi, calling him to rise and claim what had once been theirs. But there was more to the desert than power. There was also sacrifice. Faris's mind drifted to the prophecy that had been passed down through the ages, the words that had been etched into the stone of the ancient temples. When the sun rises over the desert and the blood of the kingdom stains the sands, the chosen one shall rise. But the throne is not given. It must be earned. The spear will guide the worthy, but only through fire will the kingdom be reborn. The price of power is written in the blood of the betrayer, and the kingdom shall rise or fall on the strength of the heart. The last prophecy was not just about power or conquest. It was about balance. The desert demanded balance. Power could not be wielded recklessly, nor could it be given freely. It was something that had to be earned, something that had to be fought for with honor and sacrifice. Faris's hand tightened around the spear of Rash as the first rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The time had come. The day dawned in a blaze of light, the sun casting long shadows across the desert. The armies of Al-Qamar had gathered in the vast plains outside the city walls, their banners fluttering in the wind. Faris stood at the head of his forces, the spear of Rash held high in his hand, its tip gleaming in the sunlight. His heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and dread. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty of the soldiers around him. Many of them were inexperienced, unsure of what lay ahead. But Faris knew this battle was not just for Al-Qamar. It was for the soul of the desert. The Banu Hawar had long been a thorn in the side of his kingdom, and the mercenaries they had gathered were ruthless, skilled, and hungry for power. "We stand at the crossroads of history," Faris said, his voice carrying across the battlefield. "We fight not just for our lives, but for the future of this land. The spear of Rash is not just a weapon. It is the symbol of our ancestors, the symbol of Al-Rashi. Today, we will reclaim what was lost." The soldiers cheered there, voices rising in unison as the desert wind swept through the ranks. Faris could feel the energy building, the promise of victory burning in their hearts. But the battle would not be easily won. The Banu Hawar were skilled fighters, and the mercenaries they had allied with were as deadly as they came. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath, the sand beneath their feet crackling with anticipation. As Faris raised the spear of Rash once more, he felt the power of the weapon surge through him. The ancient energy of the desert coursed through his veins, filling him with strength and clarity. This was his moment, his trial. From across the battlefield, the banners of the Banu Hawar fluttered in the wind, their warriors assembled and ready for battle. The leader of the Banu Hawar, a tall, imposing man named Rashid al-Hassan, stood at the front of his forces, his eyes locked on Faris. He had long been a rival to the Al-Sadi dynasty, and today he would bring his army to claim victory. The battle began with the sound of drums and horns, the clash of steel ringing across the desert. Faris led his forces into the fray, the spear of Rosh flashing in the sunlight as he struck down his enemies with swift precision. His soldiers followed his lead, their swords raised high as they charged into the chaos. The battlefield was a blur of movement, the cries of warriors filling the air. Faris fought with a fury he had never known, his every strike guided by the ancient power of the spear. It was as if the desert itself was lending him its strength, as if the gods had awakened from their slumber to guide him in this fight. But as the battle raged on, Faris's mind kept returning to the prophecy. The spear of Rosh was a powerful weapon, but power alone was not enough. He had to be worthy of it. He had to prove that he was the rightful heir to the throne of Al-Rashi, the one who could restore balance to the desert. The battle seemed endless, the desert turning into a sea of blood and dust. Faris fought on, his body weary, his muscles aching, but he refused to falter. Each strike brought him closer to victory, but each blow also reminded him of the cost of war. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Faris saw Rashid al-Hassan at the center of the enemy lines, his dark eyes locked on Faris. He was a formidable foe, and Faris knew that the battle would not end until one of them had fallen. Faris charged forward, his sword raised high, the spear of Rosh in his hand. He cut through the enemy ranks, his movements fluid and precise. The desert itself seemed to guide him, each strike bringing him closer to Rashid. Finally, they met in the center of the battlefield. Rashid's sword clashed against Faris's, the sound of steel ringing through the air. Faris's eyes met Rashid's, and for a moment, the world seemed to slow down. "You cannot defeat me, Faris," Rashid said, his voice cold and filled with disdain. "You are nothing but a child playing at a king. The desert has chosen me, and it will be my rule that restores balance to this land." Faris's grip on the spear tightened, and he stood tall. "The desert has chosen me, Rashid. It has chosen me to restore what was lost, to rebuild the kingdom. Your reign ends today." With that, Faris lunged forward, the spear of Rajash, flashing through the air like a bolt of lightning. The strike was swift and precise, cutting through Rashid's defenses and piercing his heart. The leader of the Banu Hawar collapsed to the ground, his life extinguished in an instant. The desert seemed to hold its breath as the battle began to turn. With Rashid's death, the Banu Hawar forces faltered, their morale shattered. Faris's soldiers pressed on, their spirits lifted by the fall of their enemy's leader. The tide of battle shifted, and soon the Banu Hawar were in retreat. But even in the face of victory, Faris felt the weight of the prophecy bearing down on him. The blood of the battle soaked into the sands of the desert, a reminder that power came with a price. He had won the battle, but the war was not yet over. The gods had abandoned him, and now it was up to him to decide the future of the kingdom. As the dust settled on the battlefield, Faris stood tall, the spear of Rosh held high in his hand. The battle for Al-Qamar had been won, but the war for the soul of the desert had just begun. The desert stretched endlessly before Faris, a vast expanse of sand and silence. The spear of Rosh still pulsed in his hand, its ancient power seeping through him, guiding him forward. The battle for Al-Qamar was over. The Banu Hawar had been defeated, and Rashid al-Hassan lay dead at his feet. The spear of Rosh fulfilled its purpose, and for a fleeting moment, Faris thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he had fulfilled his destiny. But as the last of the mercenaries were driven from the gates of Al-Qamar, Faris felt no triumph. There was no joy, no victory to celebrate. The weight of his father's throne, the weight of the kingdom, rested upon his shoulders. The blood of the fallen was still fresh in the desert sands, and the city of Al-Qamar, though victorious, was scarred. It had survived, but it had not been healed. The wound of the desert, of centuries of neglect and betrayal, ran deep, and no amount of power or swordplay could erase it. The spear of Rosh had given him the strength to fight, to reclaim the throne, but it had not given him the answers. He sought. He had learned that the desert was not just a place, it was a force, a living entity that required respect and understanding. The gods, whom his ancestors had once worshipped, had abandoned the land long ago, leaving it to suffer. Now, Faris stood at the crossroads, unsure of which path to take. The city had fallen into despair long before Faris had returned. The Al-Sadi dynasty had ruled with arrogance, dismissing the very desert that had sustained their kingdom. His father, King Khalid, had been a great leader in his youth, but he had succumbed to pride, ruling with an iron fist and forgetting the ancient ways that had once made Al-Rashi great. The gods had punished him, and the kingdom had fallen into ruin. But Faris was different. He understood the desert now. He understood the price of power and the responsibility that came with it. The spear of Rosh was not just a weapon. It was a tool of justice, of restoration. And he would wield it, not to conquer, but to rebuild. The question remained, how? Faris stood on the balcony of the palace, gazing out over the city of Al-Qamar. The streets were alive with movement, the sounds of merchants calling to each other, children playing in the dust, and the occasional clink of metal as blacksmiths forged weapons. But despite the activity, there was an undercurrent of tension, a nervous energy that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The people of Al-Qamar had been through too much. They had suffered too long, and they had no faith in the crown. Faris was the king now, but the crown was heavy. It felt like a burden, not a symbol of power. His bloodline had been blessed with strength, but it had also been cursed by pride. And now it was up to him to break the cycle, to undo the mistakes of the past and rebuild the kingdom. Behind him, Akram, the leader of the royal guard and Zayd's younger brother, entered the room. His face was set, his expression unreadable. Akram had been one of the few loyal soldiers who had fought with Faris through the battle, and though his loyalty was unquestionable, Faris could sense the weight of doubt in the man's eyes. "My prince," Akram said, his voice low, "we've received word from the remaining tribes. The Banu Hawar may have been defeated, but their allies are many. They will not stop, and neither will the mercenaries. The desert is full of them, hungry for power, for blood." Faris nodded, his mind racing. The Banu Hawar were just one faction among many, and the power of the desert was fractured. There were tribes that had long been loyal to the gods, and there were others that had turned against the very land that had birthed them. The battle he had fought was not just against the Banu Hawar. It was against centuries of distrust, of division, and of greed. "They will come for us, Akram," Faris said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "And when they do, we will be ready." Akram nodded but did not speak. The silence between them stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. Akram had always been a man of action, not words. But Faris could see the concern in his eyes, the same concern that had plagued him for days now. The desert had chosen him, but he had no idea if he could live up to the weight of that choice. "You've done what your father could never do," Akram said finally, his voice soft. "But now the real battle begins. You cannot fight this war alone." Faris turned to face him, his eyes hard. "I do not intend to fight alone. You must unite the tribes," Akram said urgently. "If you cannot, the war will drag on. The mercenaries will continue to rise, and they will tear this kingdom apart. Al-Qamar will fall once again." Faris felt the weight of his brothers. Words sink into his chest. The war for the kingdom was not over. In fact, it was just beginning. "I will unite the tribes," Faris said, his voice unwavering. "But I will do it on my terms." Faris gathered his forces, both loyal and reluctant, and set out to forge alliances with the remaining tribes of the desert. Some were skeptical, wary of his motives. Others were outright hostile, their loyalty to the Banu Hawar and their mercenary allies still fresh in their minds. But Faris knew he had no choice. He had to unite the desert, or it would destroy him. The first tribe he visited was the Al-Sabah, a nomadic group that had once been among the most powerful in the desert. They were fierce, proud warriors, and their loyalty was legendary. But they had also suffered at the hands of his ancestors, their lands taken in the name of expansion, their people enslaved. They had long since turned their backs on Al-Qamar. Faris arrived at their camp with nothing but his word and the spear of Rash. He did not bring gold or promises of riches, as his father might have done. He brought only the truth of the desert, the truth of Al-Qamar's fall, and the truth of the power that lay dormant in the land. The Al-Sabah chief, a grizzled man named Ahmad al-Fadi, eyed him warily as Faris entered the camp. "You come seeking an alliance?" Ahmad's voice was rough, his eyes narrow. "What makes you think we should trust you, Prince?" Faris held up the spear of Raj. The weapon gleamed in the sunlight, its power palpable. "This is not just a weapon of destruction," Faris said, his voice firm. "It is the key to restoring the desert. Al-Qamar is broken, but together we can rebuild it, not for the gods, but for the people of the desert." Ahmad studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You speak with the voice of a king," he said, his voice low. "But your actions must match your words." Faris knew that this was a test. He could not afford to fail. "I will prove my worth, Ahmad, not through words, but through deeds. I will fight alongside you, as I fought alongside my people. I will unite the desert, and together we will restore the kingdom." Ahmad regarded him silently for a moment longer before speaking. "You are the first prince in a long time to speak the truth. You may have my people's loyalty if you prove yourself worthy." As Faris left the camp of the Al-Sabah, he felt a small flicker of hope, but that hope was fleeting. His journey was far from over, and there were still many tribes to unite. The desert was vast, and its people were divided. But Faris knew one thing for certain. The spear of Raj was more than just a weapon. It was the symbol of a united desert, and it would be the key to reclaiming the kingdom. As he made his way toward the next tribe, he reflected on the prophecy. The price of power is written in the blood of the betrayer. He had avenged Zayd, and he had defeated the Banu Hawar, but the price of his power was still not fully paid. The desert had demanded that he fight, that he rise above the mistakes of his ancestors. But there was more to the desert's will than just vengeance. There was a balance, a price that had yet to be fully exacted. The spear of Rash was his to wield, but Faris knew that true power came with a price, and he was prepared to pay it.